Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Fireweed, and I'm coming to you from unceded territory of the Comox First Nation and the shared territory of the Kwakwaka'wakw and Coast Salish peoples, wearing today my Denman Islanders for Climate Action and Social Justice hat. I'm very pleased to have Howard speaking with us today. He has a long and illustrious career as an activist in this province and beyond, dealing with issues from indigenous sovereignty to raw log exports, climate, of course, our forest industry, and most recently and currently is serving a long house arrest. The 150-day mark is coming up this week and is part of what has inspired me to actually speak with Howard today. Howard, welcome.
Good afternoon, Fireweed. It's a pleasure and honor to share this time with you.
Thank you so much. There's so much that we could talk about, of course, and I think we could perhaps even begin this conversation talking a little bit about your history. But first of all, I do want to mention that this 150-day house arrest is part of almost ongoing intimidation by the powers that be in this province to silence activists. And this particular interview I will link to at the end, a fundraiser for legal action in support of yourself and Melanie Murray, another arrestee around forestry issues that I have interviewed for this series. Would you like to speak, first of all, to why you are currently under house arrest, and then maybe go from there back into the past a little bit to where you started on your journey as an activist?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, on Friday, as you alluded to, it marks 150 days of pre-trial, pre-sentence house arrest that I was given. As far as I know, I believe that's the harshest treatment of any activist, or for that matter, anybody quote unquote criminal at the moment in Nanaimo. There's been a pretty heavy surveillance presence and curfew checks on a regular basis throughout the 150 days. And yeah, I just last week got a call from Chilliwack RCMP because they thought I was over there, but it was a misread by the license plate reader in their cruiser, and lo and behold, I wasn't in breach of my bail condition here. But that's kind of what we can all really anticipate now under the current government, is anybody opposing indigenous decolonization, where it means that it impacts on particularly fossil fuel infrastructure or old growth logging. One can expect that you're going to have a knock at the door at some point in your activist career. And I'm certainly feeling that impact at the moment, Fireweed.
Well, what's interesting to me, in part, of course, is that you've been arrested over 40 times.
Yeah, there was a long lull while I was raising my children, but back in Ontario, I was involved in the Nonviolent Alliance and did quite a bit of anti-war action in Southern Ontario and particularly Ottawa. And when I came out here in 1991, it was following a venture that took me to the Gulf, initially to put a peace camp on the Iraqi-Saudi border, and then followed that with a peace walk in Israel, where I was deported along with a friend who I just said goodbye to, Jean McLaren, who you may remember. She was a raging granny and organizer during the Clackwood War in the Woods, and we just had her celebration of life just over a week ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I came out here and soon afterwards was employed by a number of BC NGOs, largely as a marine campaigner, staff campaigner. So I found myself constrained, like most environmentalists that work in the NGO world, where our charitable status prevented us from agitating in a political way. Certainly, it curtailed any type of nonviolent civil disobedience. So now that I'm retired from that past life, I find myself going back to the same type of strategies and tactics that we use to fight the war industry back in Ontario and elsewhere. When you were saying I've been arrested in 2 other countries as well, and I find myself reminiscing in some ways about the great number of things that we actually achieved, because it doesn't take very many people to agitate and really grab the public imagination with civil disobedience. Clackwood Sound did it. What's going on past couple of years at Fairy Creek has done the same. Extinction Rebellion has come on the scene since 2018 around the world, and that has spun off a number of other organizations like Just Stop Oil, Tire Extinguishers, Animal Rebellion, Ocean Rebellion, and here in southern BC, it's been Save Old Growth.
Now, these charges that you're going to be dealing with in court, hopefully this year, these have stemmed from primarily your involvement with Extinction Rebellion and Save Old Growth?
Yeah, so I would say half of those arrests have been as a rebel with Extinction Rebellion on Vancouver Island. These are a collection of RCMP charges that I'm now under, and I think it would be optimistic to think that my trial will be this year. Unfortunately, Melanie and I will probably be looking at a trial in the new year. And that's why the house arrest is it's more than a mild annoyance, because it's quite unusual for an activist to be locked down for as long as I have. And now one of my colleagues in Vancouver, both of us are detained at the moment because of our solidarity actions with Suatin in respect to Coastal GasLink.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the tipping point with the RCMP. They decided they wanted to crack down, not because we were blocking highways, but more of the fact that we were shutting down banks, and RBC being the most notable. I went from the RBC Bank in Nanaimo to Vancouver Island Detention Center in Victoria, right from the glue down to there. And I spent the next 8 days in solitary confinement. The first experience that I've had to understand what that was like in a maximum security remand center. I've been in one in Ottawa, but this was quite a bit different because I was placed in solitary confinement because I was on the 7th day of a hunger strike that went on for 31 days. And
can we come back to that in just a moment, Howard?
Sure.
I'd really like to interject here. I think it's appropriate to mention for our listeners that you've actually never been convicted. So to be treated like a criminal, to be placed in solitary confinement, to have this house arrest extend for such a long period of time, these are really intimidation tactics. You've sort of hinted at the difference between how you've been handled by municipal forces and the RCMP. But your commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience has been fundamental to your style of engagement, correct?
Yeah, I've never wavered from that. I think that it's not just a tactical imperative, but or a strategic one. It's a moral and ethical one for me. And living in Canada, I feel privileged that I don't need to face the same type of oppression that the over 300 activists have been murdered since 2015 around the world. And I don't think anybody in Canada is, well, it's not imminent anyway, that would happen here. So I felt I could push the envelope repeatedly, frequently, because the climate and biodiversity emergencies demanded urgent and bold activism, and which is one of the reasons I helped co-found Extinction Rebellion on Vancouver Island. Was I just felt that what we've done in the past hasn't been successful in reducing the existential threats that we face. And so for that reason, I feel that we all have to step up, be abolitionists when it comes to old growth logging, industrial agriculture, particularly here in BC, fish farms, if we want to save our iconic wild salmon. And it has been happening. Two good friends of mine who are no longer with us were part of that fight. And that motivated me to look at eco-anxiety and how that impacts activists here in British Columbia. And I feel that one solution for resolving eco-anxiety is actually to heal each other. Yes, we all need to mourn and grieve and have support for that, but we also have to organize and do things quite a bit differently if we have any any chance of bringing an end to the current madness.
Going back to your incarceration, the solitary confinement during your hunger strike, perhaps you could frame that action for us. It was a very dangerous tactic. At one point, I mean, many of us were concerned that you could lose your life. Would you like to speak to that a little bit? And you also alluded to lessons learned.
Yeah, the hunger strike was probably the edgiest thing that I've ever put myself in the sense that for 31 days, I went without food, but the I believe it was 21 days. I felt that because I was a week behind Brent Eichler, who my colleague in Vancouver, he was a week ahead
Right.
on a hunger strike as well to save our old growth in BC. And I felt that for the shared synergy of it, that I ended taking any fluids at that point, and I went some 51 hours without fluids. And I think I was probably within 30 hours of ending my life at that point. But I fortunately I have two daughters, they're both nurses, and the cardiac nurse, my daughter Sky, was with me regularly monitoring my vitals at that point. I was never left alone at night during that period of going off fluids because of the possibility that I could fall into unconsciousness and be nobody here to rescue me. So, and I just have to say a shout out again to those people that sat up all night while I was sleeping during that period. But unbeknownst to both the government and my supporters, Linda Thayer, a physician in Vancouver that my daughter was liaising with, they had done medical tests 3 times over the course of the hunger strike. And at the period of the no fluid portion of it, they knew down to, give or take 6 hours, because I said, I will go along with you pulling the plug on the hunger strike as long as you let me push it to the point that I feel that it illuminates the fact that both the forest minister, Katrine Conroy, and John Horgan were prepared to, and for that matter, the entire cabinet were prepared to let Brent and I pass away. And so they did do that, and I made it to 51 hours with no permanent damage. They did call a paramedic team to come and take me to Nanaimo Hospital during that period because of I had blurred vision and vertigo and a mild kidney pain at that point. So they called it off, and away I went. And I came back out of that, and after being rehydrated on an IV, I came back and continued the food withdrawal for another whatever it was, another week, I guess it was. But I was in pretty rough shape at that point.
What an incredible experience to go through, Howard. I'm just amazed. Now, during this time, you did receive a call, did you not, from Katrine Conroy?
Both Brent Eichler and myself received calls just before the hospital visit, and it was very clear that she was just going to stick to her talking points and talk deferrals for old growth logging, which we all know is just a future clear cut by the NDP. And I told her that. It was a very polite conversation. I know her. I know that she had a reputation as an activist, as did her deceased partner, who was also a politician. And I gave respect to that. But I said, if anything, that behooved her to be more honest with the electorate in respect to old growth logging. If anything, if you're going to cloak yourself in the mantle of activism, then I found it insulting at that point and told her so. And there was a media person knocking at the door at that point, so I ended the phone call.
That's why you ended the phone call. Interesting. This whole talk about deferrals is pretty upsetting, given that it's just more greenwash. We saw it happening back in the days of Clackwood. We think about the decades that have been invested in trying to raise awareness about the urgency of this crisis, protecting our precious carbon sinks. The fact that you invested so much of your own personal energy in the NDP party. Now, weren't you, to not then have support And that's very, very disappointing, to say the least. You were involved even in the LEAP manifesto being introduced to the Nanaimo area, were you not?
Yes, I was asked by the NDP Writing Association to come up and describe the benefits of signing on and endorsing such a manifesto, and it was turned down by the local MP, Sheila Malcolmson, who is now our cabinet minister in the Horgan government. And I was personally quite upset, actually, that because I played a major role in getting the nomination for the NDP seat initially, and she was really the underdog, and she won it handily. And to turn around and not even get so much as a text message from her, and I was getting quite a few from a great many other NDP members that knew me. Many, the vast majority treated me as a pariah, but I'm pretty thick-skinned, so I don't take that personally at all, but I think they do it to anybody. And actually the ER physician that was caring for me during that brief moment, he had cautioned me not to do this again, because he felt that he dealt with life and death every day, and the current government just considers numbers and not people. And we see that with the current health crisis that in terms of family physicians and shortages of paramedics. And yet we have billions to give to the fossil fuel industry and others that the NDP feel that they have a closer relationship to.
It does seem incredibly ironic that you are framed frequently as an extremist, given what we're facing collectively with climate collapse. When I think back to your incarceration during the hunger strike when you were put in solitary confinement, Howard, was that not a time when you also had a bit of an epiphany about the way we treat other species?
Yes, one of my caregivers during the hunger strike is a vegan, and we had lots of opportunities to have conversations about that. And during the course of the strike, the first part of it, there's two parts to it. The first part was the realization that to be a forest protector and not make the connection to the most serious threat to forest primary carbon sinks all around the planet was industrial agriculture. And for that reason, I had already decided that when the strike ended, and if I, God willing, that I made it, I would come out of it as a vegan. And the second part of it was that to be in a small cell with no privileges, just a very thin mattress on the floor, a blanket that wasn't adequate, certainly not adequate for a hunger striker, in a cold building that was built, I believe 1917 it was built, and in very rough shape. I feel badly for the prisoners that are there now, and even the staff. It's not a very comfortable building to work in or to reside in. And what's more was being locked up for, most of the 24-hour period that you're in there, you're allowed 1 hour to get out to have a shower and possibly get some exercise. But generally speaking, that's it. And it really hit me it was like a gut punch that, you get a lot of time to reflect. And I thought of all the various, particularly different livestock that experience the same sort of thing, whether or not it's veal calves to factory farm chicken husbandry, whatever. We are the most dangerous animals on the planet, and that's why some end up in prisons. But for myself, it was certainly an epiphany that no, not everybody is a dangerous individual that finds themselves there. And we should be making every effort to abolish that type of confinement, not only for human beings, but for animals of every description that humans place in cages. So
Thank you.
It's inhuman treatment, and there should be no compromise. There should be no retreat on it, and certainly no surrender by animal abolitionists that feel that that type of treatment is a crime against humanity and nature, because
Yes.
it hurts the people that actually incarcerate humans. And I think it does something to the farmers that find themselves from time to time crossing the line. They're always debating what is animal welfare rights and so forth and practices. And we all know that if it was really a transparent industry, that it would be abolished.
Really grateful for you making these associations, Howard. I think it's far too rare in the environmental communities still to this day to be addressing the animal question to the degree that we should, given the incredible impact that our food choices do have on the climate, on the environment, not just cruelty towards animals. And again, speaking from a place of power and privilege, it is those of us who are making on a daily basis, really what are considered recreational food choices. They're not ones of necessity. We're the ones that have to be stepping up and making these shifts. So, looking at what we consider to be convenient and inconvenient does affect how we organize. And there are other NGOs, as you and I have discussed, that kind of just tend to shy away, quote unquote, asking for too much from the general public. But would you agree that we are beyond that point of acquiescing to people's discomfort? Do we not need to be rocking the boat even more dramatically than is currently happening, certainly in a peaceful way, through groups like Animal Rebellion in the UK predominantly, Extinction Rebellion now around the world, Save Old Growth on Vancouver Island? Do we not need to be even more disruptive to get the message out? Isn't that the point of this activism?
Absolutely, Fireweed. There's been a lot of psychologists looking at why we're not doing it. The term cognitive dissonance has now entered the vernacular of everyday people now. We get it, right? That there's a serious disconnect for a great many people, and a great many are just preoccupied with just putting food on their table and parenting and working two jobs during this highly inflated living crisis that we're all experiencing now. And yet, if we go to the big picture, there just isn't any time to navel gaze any longer. And the average everyday person, remember when it was the 1 ton challenge, right? That was it. Well, the fossil fuel lobbyists are telling us much the same thing, that, we should be preoccupied with this or that. And it's just a distraction to the biggest single thing that we could be doing as individuals, which is to seriously look at a plant-based diet as an alternative to our fossil fuel consumption that infiltrates almost everything that we purchase in one form or another. And yet, what we put inside our bodies is something that we do have control over, and we should be dramatically finding the grocery shelves beginning to shift their offerings to plant-based alternatives and to meat. And just in the last 24 hours, there's been a major number of arrests in the UK with Animal Rebellion and trying to push the dairy industry into a place where they are accountable for their carbon emissions. And, I think the soundbite that sticks with me this morning, or today rather, is what planet are these people living on, was the cut line from one of the new ministers under the new prime minister. And I'll tell you what planet it is we're living on. We're living on a planet where, as you just pointed out, that 73,000 women just during the Labor Day weekend could not give birth to children in a hospital because they were all submerged due to the flooding there. That's the planet we live on. And we're seeing record-breaking temperatures in British Columbia right now. There's at least 3 major fires that are out of control being fought as we speak right now. And we're seeing, places like Eastern California hit 52C in Death Valley, an appropriate name for it. But that is happening all around the world. And unless it just happens to us, we don't really internalize the grief and suffering that are on the front line of the impact from largely the global north, Europe and North America, they're taking the brunt of it. And so when we see the kind of deflections that are happening in the national debate, they're very insulting. I don't want to be one of those people that generate hopium in being rescued by politicians, because it's not going to happen. And we have to get out in the streets if we're going to protect the planet, its biodiversity, human and non-human, that have yet to be born.
Well said.
Nothing short of that is going to work. Our chances are, I read yesterday a scientific paper that said we have a 0.1% chance now of sticking to 1.5C. And now people are talking about how to adapt to 3C and 4C, which is, to me, just a crime in and of itself to even talk about that. It's just part of largely the fossil fuel industry's backlash, where they're and we know they're very sophisticated in their marketing campaigns, and this is just another one of them.
Thank you so much for raising that example again about the Pakistani women. That's the kind of inconvenience, certainly, that we should be, quote unquote, inconvenience we should be focusing on, rather than the kind of disruptions that draw attention to the complicity of the banking industry, the raw log exports, the fish farm industry, the fact that we have RCMP, real repression happening in the unceded territories of this province, and really putting additional pressure there on the resistance movements around land back, et cetera, et cetera. How do we draw more attention to these issues, Howard? I know you're doing your best, putting yourself out there, and the media does seem to give you coverage. But do you have any tips or ideas for other activists about being bolder in their presentation in terms of their messaging?
Yeah, I think it begins with credibility. And as we were talking earlier about that, you can't talk about global deforestation of our carbon sinks and talk out of both sides of our mouths any longer. We have to make the connection to our diets in respect to deforestation.
Yes.
The Amazon is at the point of no return. It isn't going to rewild itself after vast acreages that are being currently experiencing record slash and burn practices to, again, support the beef industry there. And there are consequences. What happens in the Amazon affects every one of us. And in the same way, what happens at Fairy Creek affects everybody around the planet as well. One of the most educated in terms of conservation, I would say, on the planet. We have the largest intact protected areas on the planet now. I'm talking about the complex of the Great Bear Rainforest and the Tatanshini and Glacier Bay and so forth. That portion of the coast here is a shining example of what conservation biology can achieve. Mm-hmm. And it's all for naught if we don't do what is required, urgently required right now. And the 33 million people that are homeless in Pakistan right now, that's at 1.5C. And we all need home insurance if we're homeowners. And it's getting to the point where it won't even be affordable for, home ownership any longer if we can't protect ourselves from the pandemic of sorts of wildfires taking out our primary forest. Anybody that has had the experience of flying over this province knows it's no longer spectacular BC. It's really spectacular clear cutting, to the degree that I would frame it as a criminal act.
Truly.
And the same thing is happening around the boreal forests that wrap the northern hemisphere around the globe, and all of it is at tremendous risk of being liquidated.
Yes.
And, nobody, other than the Green Party is talking about addressing that scale of deforestation and liquidation of our carbon sink.
It is interesting how all of these industries intersect in terms of destruction of biodiversity. And it does bring us back around, talking about dead zones to runoff from industrial agriculture and that kind of thing. I wonder how you cope with the distressing news. I hear about deep adaptation taking root more and more in the extended environmental community. As you and I know, as longtime activists, there has been a need to dismantle these systems of oppression for a very long time. The inconveniences that we were speaking of now hitting those with the greatest privilege of choice has brought to the forefront the realities of people around the world, what they've experienced all of their lives under oppression, really in all its forms. Is it activism that is your antidote for despair?
I think the activism is merely a symptom of my values and my upbringing. And I sleep well at night. And I hope you do as well, Fireweed, because certainly you have a similar trajectory as well as far as speaking truth to power. And people live and die every day. And we all try to make a difference, but the right difference that we need to make now is one that is of an epic scale that harkens back to, growing up and hearing the stories of my relatives that went off to Europe to fight fascism and the deprivation and self-sacrifice that many of them made. You didn't hear them complaining. You didn't hear them whining. They just got down and did what needed to be done. I don't like dismissing anyone, yet at the same time, I feel that, the analogy we need to be embracing right now is that we are in a war for the integrity of our planet and our species and everything else that is sentient on it. The days of signing a petition or just simply raising a sign, feeling that you've done enough just on that level alone, I think we've got to get to the point where we start organizing so that we do put more people out in the street. If people in the thousands can get out for rights and freedoms, certainly we can get many, many more people out in the streets for survival. If we don't, that cognitive dissonance isn't something that's just a rarefied kind of problem for a small number of people. It's all of us not realizing that this is the moment and we are the people, we are the generation that has to make not just a difference, but a survival difference for everything that we love and hold dear.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you so much. Probably as good a place as any to wrap up this conversation, which I hope to continue with you over the weeks, months, and years to come.
I look forward to our next opportunity to meet one another and take solace in the fact that we're fighting a good fight.
Absolutely. Howard, I'll just conclude with a reminder to listeners that there is a fundraiser underway in support of legal defense for yourself and Melanie Murray, Denman Islander, also arrested in road blockades. The court case will differentiate between the two of you, of course, but the battle together in the court system will benefit listeners today, and I'm going to add a link to that at the end here. Thank you again for joining us today.